Let's get to our next topic. Employers may become exempt from covering birth control under a new rule proposed by the Trump administration this week. Officials are drafting an order that would replace the executive order from the Obama administration that is currently a subject of a lawsuit from the Little Sisters of the Poor. David, you're our esteemed lawyer at the table, and our local connection here, Little Sisters of the Poor, who I can't remember if they are based here, but certainly have a major footprint as an employer in Colorado. Does the lawsuit become null and void if this executive order gets tossed? What's the different ramifications from what we're seeing here?
Well, if the new regulation gives the plaintiffs, like Little Sisters of the Poor, what they want, then yes, then there's nothing more for a court to decide about. In our hierarchy, the Constitution's at the top, and then underneath that comes statutes passed by Congress. The statute here is the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, passed by an overwhelming majorities of Congress in President Clinton's first term and enthusiastically signed by President Clinton. And on the other side is a regulation created by the bureaucracy during the Obama years. And in our system, a statute beats a regulation if there's ever a conflict. And again, this was also an election issue where the American people chose the side that's currently revising the regulation. What the Religious Freedom Restoration Act says is for all federal laws going forward, when you're infringing somebody's religious freedom, that should only happen when the government doesn't have any less restrictive alternative. As the Supreme Court ruled in the Hobby Lobby case, let's say that the government's interest in people getting birth control without having to pay for it is a compelling interest of the highest order. That doesn't lead to saying that the only way that can be done is by a regulation ordering people to provide birth control contrary to their own consciences. There's lots of ways you can give, we give food stamps to people to help them eat without making that go through your employer. Employers shouldn't be in the bedroom, and if you don't want them in the bedroom, then don't ask for your bedroom supplies to come through your employment. There's lots of ways to provide birth control in other ways than by violating the conscience of religious employers.
Eric, we've looked at the legal side of things, but there's clearly a political side of this because, in deference to David's point, it's not just a bedroom issue, and there's a much more of a health issue involved. So we talked about political weapons in the last round. Is this another political weapon as we come to not the presidential election, but just to a year and a half down the road?
Of course, anything that touches on choice in life and those social issues has been a political weapon for the last several decades, and it's not going away anytime soon. I come at this issue, Dominic. First of all, I am a believer in the rights of conscience. It was the left, not all that many years ago, but many decades ago, that was, preaching conscientious objection to a war. I do think this whole country, which is so divided right now, could use a lot more tolerance on all sides, but particularly some tolerance from the left to people who have strong religious convictions. Now that said, and I identify largely with a really good editorial in the Denver Post this morning, Friday morning, on this issue. This proposed order is so overly broad. The objections that have been, whether it's Little Sisters of the Poor or other cases, have been to one specific form of birth control, an employer's obligation to provide that form of birth control. And I don't think we want to get into a big reproductive talk, but it's after the embryo implants. And then, it gets into the whole debate on when life begins. But just to have a frontal attack on birth control, I don't even know a whole lot of pro-life advocates out there who are necessarily opposed to birth control. I hope if there is an order forthcoming, it gets drafted a little better than, shall we say, the travel ban executive order of a few months ago got drafted. A memo to Donald Trump. Being president is hard. It's difficult. Nuances matter. And I think, it is possible to believe in a right of religious conscience, but that has to have some limits around it. And what we're talking about now is just such a broad debate. And if the Trump administration wants to take on birth control broadly, good luck to them, because the political backlash will be unlike anything we've seen, and we've seen a whole lot of political backlash.
Mary, what we've seen so far is that there's a draft of a proposal, and I think that's definitely on purpose. It wasn't just released and now it's law, or regulation, as David would put it. And maybe that's a balloon to kind of flood out the reaction, but what we've seen so far as the draft is pretty broad, just like Eric said. Do you think we will see that modified based on the reaction we've seen this week?
I don't think so. I think, again, this is part of controlling the media cycle, giving people things to talk about. And I also think that it's medieval to be talking about birth control in these terms, that birth control is medication. Many women use it for a variety of things, whether that's severe bleeding, severe cramping, acne, teenagers up to women who are nearly menopausal. This is medication we're talking about until we start talking about birth control in the same conversation that we're talking about Viagra, Cialis, low testosterone hormones, and a variety of other things that men need, and perhaps taking those things away or limiting how they get access to it, then we shouldn't be talking about it. This isn't a right or a left issue. This is medication, and we are an advanced country, and women should have right to birth control. And on that note, one thing we should be following in Colorado is that we do have this law now allowing women to, where you don't have to go to the pharmacy once a month to pick up your prescription. You can get a whole year's worth. When women have better access to birth control like that, we know that the unintended pregnancy rate goes down. So now in Colorado, that is becoming law. But what's happened in a lot of states where that has become law is pharmacies aren't actually enacting it. So for an example, in California, they have that law, but it's not necessarily easy for women to still access that. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, whether or not women can get their full year's supply here in Colorado.
Natasha, it's clearly a divisive issue, but a lot of women still voted for Donald Trump. So there's a lot of women who are going to be on his side in this issue. Where do you stand?
It's 2017, right?
Last time I checked.
We're still having this conversation? Okay, we can still have this conversation. And I can sit here and give you statistic after statistic about what birth control as a medicine does for women, does for our society, does for our families. And apparently that's not really getting through to a lot of people, and that's still a problem. But what I will say again and again is that it is important to talk about this as a medicine, as a public health issue, as an issue that is important for families, for men, for women. It is not a gender-only issue. It, yes, gives women the ability to control their menstrual cycle, their reproductive cycle, to make choices about when they have kids, and that can be important for a young woman, but that can be equally as important for someone who's in their 30s hoping to have a second child, who's maybe waiting until she gets that promotion at work. So maybe someday she could get equal pay, which is a totally different conversation, but related to all of this, which is why this little draft is still important to discuss, and it's important for us to continue talking about, because ultimately the pill, maybe it's a covfefe moment, maybe the coverage of the pill is wrong, and we should stop calling it birth control, but what it is, which is something that helps women control their reproductive health in a hormonal way. And in particular, that can be taking care of acne, that can be dealing with irregular periods, that can be dealing with a whole host of issues, including very serious medical conditions like polycystic ovary syndrome, which can lead to heart disease and diabetes. So if we're denying women access to a medicine that can help treat or even prevent those issues, what does that say about us? So this conversation, yeah, let's change the tone on it to really think of it as a people's human public interest issue.